The Historiography of the Divine Decree, Title and Introduction. The Historiography of the Divine Decree. Deconstructing methodological naturalism and reclaiming the resurrection within the promise plan of God. Walter C. Kaiser Jr. describes the promise plan of God as a unified narrative of redemption grounded in actual historical events. This narrative culminates in the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. However, post-enlightenment historiography, influenced by methodological naturalism, systematically excludes supernatural causes. This approach distances the biblical narrative from its original Hebraic context. Utilizing Michael R. Licona's methodological approach, this essay critically engages with the philosophical objections raised by David Hume, Bart D. Ehrman, John P. Meier, and others. It argues that when approached with methodical neutrality and critical realism, the resurrection hypothesis most adequately accounts for the historical data. This event affirms Jesus' obedience, overcomes rebellious spiritual powers, initiates the restoration of the cosmic temple, and upholds promises to ethnic Israel while incorporating the nations into one people of God. Introduction: The epistemological crisis of biblical history. Within biblical theology, the organic unity of Scripture is predicated on the assertion that the Creator has intervened decisively in history. Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s promise plan of God presents a redemptive narrative that reclaims fractured creation and restores humanity's royal priestly vocation through concrete historical events, culminating in the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Nevertheless, academic study of this event is frequently constrained by methodological naturalism, which excludes supernatural causation from historical inquiry. This framework severs the biblical narrative from its ancient Hebraic cognitive environment. Biblical authors understood the cosmos as a contested temple governed by Yahweh amid rebellious spiritual powers, a perspective that methodological naturalism reduces to mere myth. To evaluate the claims of the Apostolic Scriptures, theologians must address these philosophical obstacles. Drawing on Michael R. Licona's historiographical approach, this essay deconstructs the a priori objections of prominent skeptical scholars. Employing methodical neutrality and critical realism, historians may legitimately investigate the resurrection. When the constraints of naturalism are removed, the resurrection emerges as the most plausible explanation and the verifiable, non-supersessionist climax of God's redemptive purpose for Israel and the nations. Section 1. The Shadow of Hume and the Illusion of Uniform Experience. The principal objection to miracles originates with David Hume, who contended that the uniformity of human experience makes reports of miracles less probable than the possibility that the testimony is false. This principle has long mandated preference for natural explanations. Critical analysis reveals significant flaws. Hume's claim of uniform experience begs the question by dismissing widespread testimony of miracles across cultures and eras. Singular, unrepeatable events lie at the heart of historical inquiry. In the biblical worldview, natural laws describe God's faithful order within the cosmic temple, but do not constrain the Creator. Sovereign intervention advances the promise plan consistently with, rather than contrary to, that order. Historians should therefore evaluate the evidence with methodical neutrality. Section 2. Probability, background knowledge, and the canons of history. Bart D. Ehrman advances human skepticism, maintaining that historians can only establish probable events and that miracles, as violations of natural law, are exceedingly improbable. Any natural explanation, however strained, is thus deemed preferable. This collapses under scrutiny. As William Lane Craig observes, probability assessments depend on background knowledge. The Christian claim is not a natural resuscitation, but a supernatural raising by the God of Israel. If this God exists and intends to vindicate Jesus as Messiah, the resurrection is not improbable. Ehrman's position presupposes philosophical naturalism rather than deriving it from historical method. Historians can evaluate the evidence without first resolving the question of God's existence or intentions. Section 3. The demarcation problem, crossing the line from history to theology. Scholars such as John P. Meier, A.J.M. Wedderburn, and James D.G. Dunn acknowledge the possibility of verification of the empty tomb or of appearances, yet insist that attributing them to God crosses into theology. This demarcation misrepresents historical practice. Historians routinely posit unobservable entities, such as intentions or psychological states. In the religiously saturated covenantal context of Jesus' self-understanding, signs, and execution, resurrection constitutes strong evidence of divine agency. Historians may identify a miracle when a naturally inexplicable event occurs in a context charged with religious significance, without specifying its precise mechanism. Section 4. Horizons, Incommensurability, and Critical Realism. C. Behan McCullough highlights the historian's horizon, worldview-shaped biases that can impede consensus. Critical realism acknowledges epistemic limitations while affirming that historical descriptions can correspond to reality. It anchors evaluation in historical bedrock, Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples' belief in his post-mortem appearances, and Paul's conversion. Methodological naturalism itself is a philosophical horizon requiring defense, applying criteria for the best explanation, explanatory scope, power, plausibility, minimal ad hoc character, and illumination. The resurrection hypothesis surpasses naturalistic alternatives. With the horizons of critical realism cleared, the historian is free to evaluate the resurrection hypothesis within the canonical trajectory of the promise plan. Section 5. The resurrection as the climax of the promise plan. The resurrection is not an isolated event, but the teleological culmination of God's single unified promise plan. Jesus, the faithful Israelite and last Adam, embodied perfect covenantal obedience. His death disarmed rebellious powers. His resurrection vindicated that obedience and inaugurated the restoration of the cosmic temple. This historical reality reverses the fractures of Eden, the Watchers, and Babel, while preserving the irrevocable promises to ethnic Israel, as described in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 29. Gentiles are grafted into Israel's commonwealth, as in Romans 11:17 and Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, as expansion, not replacement. Even among critical scholars, N.T. Wright acknowledges that the surprising historical facts surrounding the resurrection demand a compelling explanation, underscoring its centrality. Conclusion. Methodological naturalism has imposed an epistemological crisis, distorting Scripture's organic unity by confining it to a materialist framework. Rigorous historiographical analysis liberates the discipline. Under the principles of methodological neutrality and critical realism, historians may investigate miracle claims. The resurrection best explains the historical bedrock and anchors the promise plan. It demonstrates Yahweh's faithfulness to his covenants, defeats the powers of darkness, and inaugurates the eternal restoration of the cosmic temple, preserving concrete promises to ethnic Israel within the one people of God. This historically verifiable event summons biblical theologians and the Church to renewed confidence in Scripture's unified progressive witness,